"You don't belong here, old man. I don't know who let you through the gate, but this is an active installation and you need to turn yourself around and walk back the way you came." The voice belonged to Sergeant First Class Raymond Pruitt, 36 years old, built like something assembled for the specific purpose of discouraging argument. His uniform starched, and his jaw set in the particular way of a man who has spent his career being the largest and loudest presence in every room he entered, and has come to confuse that with being the most significant. He was standing at the entrance to Hangar 4 on Fort Braxton, South Carolina, blocking the doorway with his body the way a dam blocks water. Not because the water has asked permission, but because the dam is simply there, and the water has no choice. Behind him, inside the hangar, 24 Special Forces candidates were running a final equipment check before a unit evaluation that Pruitt had spent 3 weeks organizing, and the last thing he needed was some civilian wandering in off the parade ground and disrupting the flow of the morning. The man standing in front of him was 83 years old. His name was Earl Doss, and he had driven 4 hours from Savannah that morning in a pickup truck that smelled of sawdust and motor oil, arriving at Fort Braxton on a visitor's pass obtained through a process that had taken 6 phone calls and 3 weeks and had involved a retired major general's personal intervention, though Earl Doss had not asked for any of that and had been faintly embarrassed when he found out. He was wearing what he always wore, worn canvas trousers the color of old pine, a plain denim work shirt washed to the consistency of flannel, and a jacket so faded and shapeless with age that it had ceased to have a color and simply had a quality. The way certain objects acquire a presence that transcends their original description. His hands were at his sides, large hands, heavy-knuckled, mapped with the geography of decades of physical labor, but resting with an absolute stillness that was not passivity. It was the stillness of something at rest that knows its own weight. He did not respond to Pruitt immediately. He stood in the September morning air outside Hangar 4 and looked at the sergeant with eyes the color of a winter sky, pale and clear and depthless in the way of still water over great depth. And he let the silence sit between them for long enough that it became something Pruitt had to decide what to do with. "I was told to report here at 0800, Earl said. His voice was low and unhurried, a dry and quiet rasp, the kind of voice that is given orders in conditions where volume was a liability and clarity was everything. "I have a pass." He produced it from his breast pocket, a laminated Fort Braxton visitor's credential, signed at the base commander's office, stamped with the correct date. He held it out with the steadiness of a man who has held things steadier than this, in situations considerably less comfortable than a sunny September morning in South Carolina. Pruitt looked at the pass. Something shifted in his expression. A small recalculation. The kind that occurs when a man's first assessment encounters evidence but is not yet prepared to revise itself. He handed it back. "That pass gives you access to the administrative building, not to operational facilities." "I was told Hangar 4, Earl said. "By who?" "Colonel Mabry's office." Pruitt made a sound in the back of his throat that was not quite a laugh, but was designed to achieve the same effect. The sound of a man who has decided that the bureaucratic mechanism producing this situation is flawed, and that the most efficient correction is simply to be immovable. "Colonel Mabry doesn't schedule guest appearances during a unit evaluation. Whoever you spoke to made a mistake. I'm going to need you to step back and... Is there a problem out here?" The voice came from inside the hangar, from somewhere in the organized activity of the equipment check, and it had the flat and carrying quality of someone accustomed to projecting into large spaces. A staff sergeant named Lena Carver appeared in the doorway beside Pruitt, 27 years old, 4 years in, sharp-eyed in the way of people who have learned that the details other people overlook are frequently the ones that matter. She looked at Pruitt. She looked at the man he was blocking. She looked at the jacket. Her eyes stopped. She had spent 2 years assigned to the Special Forces Assessment and Selection Support Staff before her current posting, and in that time she had developed the particular visual literacy of someone who has spent a great deal of time around objects that carry history. She was not certain she was reading the jacket correctly. The patches and insignia were old, faded, arranged in a configuration she had seen in photographs but not on a living person, but she was certain enough that something inside her went very quiet and very alert. "Sergeant Pruitt," she said carefully. "Can I talk to you for a second? I'm handling it." "Yes, sir. Can I talk to you anyway?" Something in her tone, a controlled and deliberate quality, made Pruitt turn and look at her. She was not arguing. She was not challenging. She was asking with the specific gravity of someone who is certain they are preventing something. He stepped a foot to the left, and she leaned in and said something in a voice too low to carry. Pruitt looked at the jacket, looked at the man, looked back at Carver. His expression did not soften. It was not built for softening. But it moved, shifted into something less certain of its own architecture. "Wait here," he said to Earl Doss, and he said it with slightly less of the original force behind it, the way a door sounds different when the latch is less engaged. Earl nodded. He stood in the September morning and waited with the patience of someone who has waited in conditions considerably less comfortable and considerably more consequential than a hangar doorway, and he looked out across the Fort Braxton flight line, where the heat was already beginning to shimmer off the tarmac even at this hour. And he let the morning be the morning. Inside the hangar, Carver had found a phone. She did not call Colonel Mabry's office. She called a number she had written in the back of a small notebook she kept in her breast pocket. A number given to her by a retired command sergeant major at a training seminar 2 years ago, pressed into her hand with the specific instruction that she was only to use it if she was absolutely certain she was looking at what she thought she was looking at. She had thought, at the time, that this was the kind of dramatic instruction that never actually produces an occasion for use. She had kept the number anyway, because the man who gave it to her was not given to drama. The phone rang twice. A voice answered, gravel and iron, the voice of a man who picks up phones expecting them to contain things that require immediate decisions. She said 3 words. She said the name on the jacket. The silence on the other end lasted 4 full seconds, which was 3 seconds longer than any silence she had ever heard from that voice. Then, "Say that again." She said it again. "Where are you?" "Fort Braxton, sir, Hangar 4. Is he still there?" "Yes, sir. Sergeant Pruitt has him at the door. Do not let him leave." "Do you understand me? Do not let that man leave that hangar." The line went dead. She stood for a moment holding the phone in the cool interior of the hangar while the candidates finished their equipment checks around her, and then she walked back to the doorway and stood beside Pruitt and said nothing, and waited. Earl Doss was looking at a sparrow that had landed on the tarmac 6 feet away and was investigating a crack in the concrete with the methodical intensity of something with a very specific and private purpose. Earl watched it the way a man watches things when he has learned that attention is not always purposeful and that sometimes the proper relationship with the world is simply to let it happen in front of you. "You can wait inside if you'd like," Carver said. Earl looked at her. He looked at the sparrow. He stepped inside. Pruitt said nothing, but his jaw had developed a tension that had not been there 20 minutes ago. They did not have to wait long. The sound came first, the particular compound sound of multiple vehicles moving at speed on base, the kind of sound that does not belong to routine activity, that carries in it a purposefulness that causes people to stop what they are doing and orient toward it. Candidates looked up from their equipment. Pruitt turned toward the hangar doors. 3 vehicles, 2 black SUVs and a staff car, came across the flight line at a pace that was not quite running, but was not anything less than urgency, and they stopped outside Hangar 4 with a precision of placement that suggested the drivers had been told exactly where to put them. The man who got out of the staff car was Major General Harris Colton, Commanding General of the Special Forces Command, and he was not moving the way a man moves when he is attending a scheduled event. He was moving the way a man moves when he has been handed information that has reorganized his understanding of the morning. He was 55 years old. He had been at Fort Braxton for 14 months. He had 2 combat deployments in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan, and a record that could stop a room full of experienced soldiers, which was a fact he did not think about, because men of that kind tend not to catalog their own weight. He crossed the tarmac with his aide 3 steps behind him, and he went through the hangar doors without acknowledging Pruitt, who had come to attention with a speed that suggested his body had made the decision before his brain confirmed it. General Colton went straight to Earl Doss. He stopped in front of him. He looked at the jacket, at the patches, at the specific arrangement of insignia and qualification badges, and the small, deliberately simple unit crest at the left shoulder. And something moved across his face that the candidates inside the hangar, who had stopped pretending to check their equipment, would each describe differently when they talked about it later. But all of their descriptions contained the same word. The word was something close to awe. Pruitt was still at attention. He was beginning to understand, in the way that a building understands a structural problem, that his morning had taken a turn from which it was not going to recover unchanged. General Colton did not salute. He did something the candidates would talk about for the length of their careers. Something that traveled through the Fort Braxton rumor network by end of day and reached the Pentagon inside a week, and that every person who witnessed it would describe with the same quality of stunned simplicity. He reached out and gripped Earl Doss by both shoulders, by the lapels of the old faded jacket, and he held him for a moment, and he said, in a voice stripped of every layer of rank and institution and public performance until it was simply one person speaking to another, "We have been looking for you for 11 years." Earl Doss looked at him. His face did not do what a face does when it is surprised. It did what a face does when it has been patient for a long time and has not been certain the patience would be justified but continued being patient anyway, because there was nothing else to do with it. He said, very quietly, "I wasn't hiding." "I know," the general said. "We weren't looking in the right places." He turned, and this was the moment that stopped everyone in Hangar 4. The moment that Sergeant Carver would write about in a letter to her mother that night, and Sergeant First Class Pruitt would carry in his chest like a bruise for the next 3 months. He turned to the assembled candidates, and he said, "At ease. Sit down if you need to. You are about to receive a class that was not on your schedule, and it is going to be the most important one you attend at this installation." He looked at Pruitt for the first time. His expression was not angry. It was something more difficult to receive than anger. It was the expression of someone who has been disappointing people simply by seeing what they are. "Sergeant Pruitt," he said, "you will listen." "Yes, sir." General Colton turned back to Earl Doss. He told the room, in the manner of a man reading from a record that should have been public knowledge and wasn't, only because the people whose job it was to make it so had collectively failed at it for 4 decades. Earl Doss. Master Sergeant, retired, United States Army Special Forces. Entered service 1962. 3 tours in Vietnam, including 2 with Mac Sog operating in denied territory across the Laotian and Cambodian borders. Recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest military decoration, for actions on March 4, 1969, in which he had carried a wounded officer 2 kilometers through active contact, while maintaining radio communication with an air asset that he directed to within 60 meters of his own position in order to suppress an encircling force. Silver Star, 3 bronze stars with valor, 2 Purple Hearts, the second of which he had not reported because reporting it would have required evacuation, and he had declined evacuation. The room was completely silent. The general said Earl Doss had left the army in 1974 and had returned to Savannah and had spent the intervening 50 years building furniture. He had a shop on the outskirts of the city, and he built tables and chairs and bookcases from Georgia pine and black walnut, and he sold them at prices that did not account for what they were worth, and he did not advertise, and he did not apply for veterans' benefits, and he did not attend reunions, and he had not spoken publicly about his service in any context since 1975. The Army had been trying to locate him for 11 years to present a decoration that had been approved in 1971 and lost in a paperwork failure so spectacular it had resulted in a procedural review. It had taken this long because Earl Doss was not findable by anyone looking in the places where people who want to be found can be found. He was findable, it turned out, by a retired Major General who had served with a man who had served with Earl Doss in 1969 and who had been at a woodworking exhibition in Savannah 6 months ago and had recognized the name on a tag attached to a walnut side table that was so precisely and honestly made that he had stood in front of it for 10 minutes before he read the tag. And when he read it, he had sat down on a bench nearby and made a phone call. After the general finished, the hangar was quiet for a long moment. Then he produced a case. Inside it was a medal, the Distinguished Service Cross, the one that had been approved 53 years ago and never delivered. He pinned it to the old jacket, above the other decorations, beside the faded patches and the worn crest, and he stepped back. Earl Doss looked down at it. He touched it once, briefly, with 2 fingers. He looked up. "I'd like to say something to these young people," he said. "Please," the general said. Earl turned to the candidates. He looked at them for a moment, their youth, their fitness, their equipment still half-checked on the hangar floor, their faces arranged in the expression of people who have been genuinely surprised by what the morning turned out to contain. He had been their age once, in a jungle on the other side of the world, carrying things heavier than equipment. "What you're doing here matters," he said. "Not because anyone is going to know about it. Most of what matters, nobody knows about. You will do the best things of your life in places that don't have names, and for people who will never learn your name in return. And that is exactly how it's supposed to be. The job is the job. The work is the work. Do it right, and go home and build something with your hands, and don't spend a day of your life waiting for anyone to come pin a piece of metal on your chest." He paused, though I will say, when they do, it doesn't hurt. There was laughter in the hangar, genuine laughter, the kind that only comes when a room has been holding something tight and finds a moment to release it. Sergeant Pruitt found Earl Doss in the parking lot 2 hours later, after the ceremony had concluded and the vehicles had dispersed, and the candidates had returned to their evaluation with something new and difficult and valuable behind their eyes. Pruitt was out of his starched certainty in a way that had nothing to do with his uniform and everything to do with whatever had happened to the interior architecture of a man who has spent the morning discovering the dimensions of his own error. He said, "Sergeant Doss, Master Sergeant, I owe you an apology." Earl was unlocking his truck. He turned and looked at Pruitt with those winter sky eyes, and he did not make the apology easy, and he did not make it hard. He accepted it the way he had accepted everything that morning, with the unhurried steadiness of a man who has long since stopped requiring the world to be a particular way before he participates in it honestly. You didn't know, Earl said. I should have looked more carefully. Yes, Earl said simply. You should have. He opened the truck door. That's what you do with that. You look more carefully from here on. He got in. It's not complicated. It just takes practice. He drove out through the Fort Braxton Gate and onto the South Carolina highway headed south toward Savannah. And the old jacket rode in the passenger seat beside him, because the morning had been warm enough that he'd folded it off his shoulders before he drove, and the Distinguished Service Cross was still pinned to it, catching the September light once, briefly, as he passed through a stretch of road where the tree cover broke and the sun came through. There are men who build things in quiet places and ask nothing from the world for having built them. They are the reason the world has the shape it does. Most of them you will never know. A few of them, if you look carefully enough and in the right places, you will find sitting at a table they made themselves, or standing at a hangar door with a visitor's pass and 50 years of patience in their eyes. If you were moved by Earl Doss's story of quiet courage and earned wisdom, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to see it, and be sure to subscribe to Veterans Valor for more stories of America's unassuming heroes.